They say the Arctic is silent, an endless frozen void where the only sound is the wind scraping across the ice. That's a lie. If you know where to listen, the ice has stories to tell. We learned that the hard way during a mission in the winter of 1994. What we heard beneath the ice that night, what we saw, should never have been uncovered. It wasn't just unnatural, it was alive, and it's still out there. I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to forget, telling myself it was some kind of shared delusion, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation and cold, but deep down, I know what I saw. What I felt was real. The Navy classified the whole thing, buried it under layers of bureaucracy, and wrote it off as mechanical failure. I don't blame them. If the public knew what was down there, it would change everything. Maybe that's why I'm speaking now. Someone needs to know. We went into those waters believing we understood the world. We were wrong. The Arctic has always been a strange place, a vast, inhospitable wilderness that seems to swallow light and sound. For centuries, sailors told stories of phantom ships and ghostly figures appearing on the ice, dismissed as the ramblings of men driven mad by isolation. But in the late 20th century, things started happening that couldn't be brushed off so easily. Sonar anomalies, strange signals coming from the depths, reports of equipment behaving erratically. It became harder to ignore. Some blamed natural phenomena, seismic activity, or even rogue Soviet operations. Whatever the cause, the Arctic became a place of quiet paranoia, a place where you never truly felt alone. Our mission was routine, at least on the surface. We were part of a reconnaissance team aboard the USS Greystone, a fast attack submarine designed for covert operations. It wasn't unusual for us to be deployed to remote regions, and the Arctic was no exception. The official briefing was vague: patrol the area, monitor for unusual activity, and report back, standard Navy protocol. But even before we left port, there were whispers among the crew. Something about classified orders and higher-ups breathing down the captain's neck. I didn't think much of it at the time. In the Navy, you learn to follow orders without asking too many questions. The first few days were uneventful, the monotony of submarine life setting in. The Arctic is as desolate below the surface as it is above, a cold, black expanse that stretches on forever. The sonar operator, a young guy we called Murph, joked that it was like staring into the void. He wasn't wrong. There's something about the ocean at that depth that makes you feel small, insignificant. It's easy to forget there's an entire world above you, a world of light and warmth. Down there, it's just you and the dark. The anomaly appeared on the 4th day. Murph was the first to notice it, a faint signal, barely distinguishable from background noise. At first we thought it was a glitch, some kind of interference, but the signal was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like a pulse. Murph ran it through the system, trying to isolate it, but the more he analyzed it, the less sense it made. It wasn't like anything we'd encountered before. Not seismic activity, not another vessel, not marine life. It was something else. The captain ordered us to investigate. As we closed in on the source of the signal, the atmosphere on the sub shifted. It's hard to explain, but you could feel the tension, the unspoken fear. Even the seasoned officers seemed uneasy. The Arctic is unpredictable, and you learn to expect the unexpected, but this was different. The closer we got, the stronger the signal became, and with it came something else. A low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the hull. It wasn't loud, barely audible, but you could feel it in your bones, like a distant vibration. It made your teeth ache and your head throb. We reached the coordinates just after midnight. Outside, the water was a frigid, impenetrable black, illuminated only by the sub's exterior lights. At first, there was nothing, just the endless expanse of the ocean floor, but then Murph spotted it. A structure rising out of the seabed, its surface faintly glowing. It was massive, easily the size of a skyscraper, But it wasn't the size that struck me. It was the shape. It didn't look natural, more like a spire, with sharp, angular lines that seemed too precise to be geological. We sent out a remote-operated vehicle to get a closer look. As the ROV approached, its lights revealed more details. The surface of the spire was covered in intricate patterns, almost like carvings, but they didn't resemble any writing or symbols I'd ever seen. They were organic, fluid, as if they were growing out of the structure itself, and the glow, it wasn't constant. It pulsed, dimming and brightening in a way that almost felt alive. That's when the equipment started failing. First, it was the sonar, then the navigation systems. The lights flickered, and the hum we'd been hearing grew louder, more insistent. Crew members began complaining of headaches, some even experiencing nosebleeds. The ROV's feed cut out entirely, leaving us staring at static. The captain ordered us to pull back, but before we could, something happened that I'll never forget. The glow from the spire intensified, flooding the water with an eerie, greenish light. At first, I thought it was some kind of reaction to our presence, but then I saw it. Something was moving near the base of the spire, a shadow darker than the surrounding water. It was massive, its shape hard to define, but I caught glimpses of translucent skin and what looked like glowing orb-like eyes. It moved with an unnatural grace, coiling and uncoiling as it circled the structure. For a moment I thought it was ignoring us, but then it stopped. It turned toward the sub, and I swear those glowing eyes locked onto us. I froze, my hands gripping the console. I wasn't the only one. The control room was silent, every man staring at the screen in front of them. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. And then, without warning, the creature vanished, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. The captain ordered an immediate retreat, and the engines roared to life. As we pulled away, the hum faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes you feel like you're being watched. That was the last we saw of the spire, or the creature. We made it back to port without further incident, but the crew was shaken. No one talked about what happened, not openly. The Navy debriefed us, and we were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements. The official report listed the incident as a mechanical failure. I didn't argue. At the time, I was just glad to be alive, but I can't stop thinking about it. The spire, the patterns, the creature, they weren't natural. They weren't from this world. And if they're still down there waiting, then it's only a matter of time before someone else finds them. When that happens, I hope they're ready for what comes next. After we left the spire behind, I thought the worst was over. Most of us did. We were shaken, sure, but the captain's insistence on retreat felt like the right call. Whatever that thing was, it clearly didn't want us there, and none of us were eager to find out what would happen if we stuck around. The hum was gone, the equipment was stabilizing, and for the first time in hours, the air in the control room didn't feel like it was pressing against my chest, but there was something else, something I didn't notice right away, a stillness that wasn't natural. It took me a few minutes to realize what was wrong. The sub was running smoothly, the engines humming softly beneath us, but the Arctic itself had gone silent. Normally, even at those depths, you hear things. The occasional creak of the ice above, the distant groan of shifting water, the faint crackle of thermal currents. But now, there was nothing. Not even the sonar was picking up ambient noise. It was as if the ocean had swallowed itself, leaving us suspended in a void. Murph was the first to comment on it, his voice low and uncertain. "You hear that?" he asked, glancing around like he expected an answer to come from somewhere other than the room. Nobody replied, but we all knew what he meant. The captain ordered a diagnostic, but everything checked out. No malfunctions, no interference. just silence. That's when I noticed how cold it was. Submarines are usually kept at a steady temperature, but the air in the control room felt sharp, like it was cutting into my skin. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake off the chill, but it didn't help. Around me, I could see others doing the same, shifting in their seats or wrapping their arms around themselves. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the way the cold seemed to settle inside you, as if it wasn't coming from the outside, but from somewhere deeper. The captain tried to keep everyone focused, assigning busy work and running drills to distract from the unease creeping through the crew. It worked for a while, but then the anomalies started. They were small at first, things you could almost explain away. A sudden flicker of the lights, a faint, rhythmic knocking that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. We'd heard knocks before, usually from ice scraping the hull, but this was different. It was too steady, too deliberate. Like someone or something was out there, waiting. By the time we hit the next anomaly, the tension was thick enough to choke on. It started with the sonar. Murph was running a routine scan when the system picked up a signal, a single pulsing rhythm that felt disturbingly familiar. It was faint, weaker than before, but unmistakable. The spire, or something, connected to it. Murph paled as he stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the controls like he didn't want to touch them. "It's moving," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The room went still. I leaned over his shoulder, watching the screen. He was right. The signal was moving, slowly but steadily, like it was following a path. The problem was, the path led directly to us. I could feel the captain's eyes on the back of my neck, but I didn't turn around. None of us spoke as we watched the signal close the distance, the rhythmic pulse growing louder in my mind with every passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the signal vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. We tried to shake it off, convincing ourselves it was a glitch, some kind of feedback loop we hadn't accounted for, but I could see the fear in Murph's eyes, the way his hands trembled as he fiddled with the controls, and I could feel it too, that same cold, gnawing fear, like we were being watched. The rest of the crew felt it as well. People were snapping at each other over nothing, tempers flaring in ways that didn't make sense. Even the captain seemed on edge, his usual calm demeanor giving way to a sharpness that set my teeth on edge. Then came the second signal. This one was stronger, clearer, and it wasn't alone. Multiple pings, echoing through the void like a chorus of warnings. They were scattered, coming from all directions, closing in on us with an almost predatory precision. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw something. A shadow passing through the faint glow of the control room, just at the edge of my vision. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. The captain ordered us to dive, hoping to evade whatever was out there, but the deeper we went, the worse it got. The signals were all around us now, pulsing in a chaotic rhythm that made my head throb. The knocking returned, louder this time, echoing through the hull with a resonance that made my stomach churn. And then there was the smell, a faint, acrid tang that reminded me of burned electronics, sharp and bitter. It seemed to seep through the vents, clinging to everything it touched. Murph's voice cut through the chaos, high and panicked. "I've got movement on the cameras," he shouted, his hands flying over the controls. The main monitor lit up with a grainy feed from one of the external cameras, and my heart stopped. The spire was back, or at least something that looked like it. It was smaller than the one we'd seen before, but the same pulsating glow radiated from its surface, casting eerie shadows through the water. And just like before, something was moving near it. This time, it wasn't a shadow. It was clear, undeniable. The creature, or creatures, were circling the spire, their translucent forms almost invisible against the black water. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. Their movements too fluid, too coordinated to be anything natural. They moved as one, coiling and uncoiling around the spire in a way that made my stomach turn. Then, as if sensing the camera, they stopped. One of them turned, its glowing eyes locking onto the lens with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. The screen went dark. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then the alarms started. Proximity warnings blared through the control room, red lights flashing in every corner. The creatures were coming, their signals growing louder and closer with every passing second. I felt the sub shudder as the captain ordered a full-speed ascent, the engines groaning in protest. But it wasn't fast enough. There was a sound, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. The hull vibrated violently, and I was thrown to the floor, my head slamming against the console. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the captain's face, pale and drawn, his mouth moving in a silent curse as the lights flickered and died. When I came to, the world was tilted. My head throbbed, my ears rang, and my mouth tasted of iron. Around me, the control room was in chaos, dim emergency lights flickering weakly against the metallic walls. The acrid smell of burned circuitry hung thick in the air, stinging my eyes and throat. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, or why everything felt so wrong. Then it hit me. The spire, the creatures, the roar. The floor shuddered beneath me as another vibration rippled through the hull, a low, bone-deep tremor that felt more alive than mechanical. I scrambled to my feet, gripping the edge of a console to steady myself. The captain was shouting orders, his voice hoarse but firm, trying to wrestle the crew back to order. Murph was slumped over the sonar station, his face pale and slack, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose. The medic was kneeling beside him, frantically checking his pulse. "What's our status?" I croaked, my voice barely audible over the alarm still blaring in the background. The officer nearest to me, Jenkins, glanced up with wide, terrified eyes. "Engines are shot," he said, his voice trembling. "We're dead in the water." My stomach sank. The Arctic wasn't a place you wanted to drift helplessly, not with the crushing depths below and the ice above. But it wasn't just the environment I was afraid of. Something was still out there, something we couldn't outrun even if the engines were working. The realization tightened like a fist in my chest. Murph stirred then, letting out a low groan. His eyelids fluttered open, and he blinked up at us with a glassy, faraway look. "It's still watching," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's still watching?" I asked, leaning closer, though I already knew the answer. He turned his head slowly toward the monitor, his blood-stained fingers reaching weakly for the controls. It never left. The sonar was still operational, running on auxiliary power, but what it displayed made my blood run cold. The signals were back, stronger now, pulsing in erratic, overlapping rhythms that filled the room with an oppressive, almost deafening hum. And there was something else. Shapes, faint and flickering, moving in patterns that defied logic. They were surrounding us, circling like predators closing in on wounded prey. The captain slammed his fist against the console, silencing the alarm. "We need power to the engines now," he barked, his face a mask of barely contained fear. "If we can't move, we're done." "We don't even know what done means," muttered Jenkins, his voice edged with hysteria. "Those things, what the hell are they? What do they want?" "Doesn't matter," the captain snapped. "We're not sticking around to find out. Get me a systems report." As the crew scrambled to assess the damage, I moved to Murph's side. He was staring at the monitor, his eyes fixed on the shapes with a mixture of dread and fascination. "Murph," I said softly, "what do you see?" He shook his head slowly, his lips trembling. "It's not just them. The spire. It's alive. It's part of them. Or they're part of it. I don't know. It's like it's all connected." "What do you mean connected?" I pressed, my skin crawling. "Look," he said, pointing a shaky finger at the screen. "It's sending signals too, but not to us. To them. I followed his gaze, my stomach turning as I realized he was right. Amid the chaotic patterns, there was a distinct rhythm emanating from the spire itself, a pulsing signal that seemed to ripple outward like a heartbeat. And the creatures, they weren't just moving randomly, they were responding, aligning themselves with the spire's pulses in an eerie, synchronized dance. The air in the control room felt heavier, the temperature dropping sharply, as if the cold of the Arctic itself was seeping through the walls. My breath fogged in front of me, and I noticed frost beginning to creep along the edges of the consoles. Someone cursed loudly, and I turned to see Jenkins brushing ice crystals off his station. "This is impossible," he said, his voice rising. "The temperature can't drop this fast, not inside the sub." "It's not the sub," Murph murmured. "It's them. They're doing this." Before I could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging us into near darkness. A faint, greenish glow seeped through the portholes, casting unnatural shadows that danced across the walls. The knocking returned, louder this time, resonating through the hull with a sickening rhythm that matched the spire's pulses. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, insistent, a message. The captain's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "All hands, prepare for emergency surfacing. If we can't power the engines, we'll blow the ballast tanks manually." "Are you insane?" Jenkins shouted. "We don't even know if the ice above us is stable. We could get trapped or crushed." "Better than sitting here waiting to die," the captain shot back. "Unless you have a better idea, shut up and do your job." The crew moved with grim determination, their fear replaced by the cold efficiency of men with no other options. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, every sound amplified by the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The glow outside intensified, the shadows growing sharper, more defined. I thought I saw something move, just a flicker, a suggestion of a shape, but when I looked again, it was gone. As we prepared to surface, another vibration rippled through the hull, this one deeper and more violent. The sub groaned in protest, and I heard the sickening sound of metal straining under pressure. Then came the voice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through my chest, filling the control room with a presence that felt vast and unknowable. The words, if they were words, were incomprehensible, a series of tones and clicks that seemed to bypass the ears entirely, resonating directly in the mind. Murph screamed, clutching his head as blood streamed from his nose and ears. Others followed, dropping to their knees as the sound intensified, a relentless assault on our senses that left me gasping for breath. The captain staggered, his hands gripping the console as he shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, watching, waiting. I struggled to my feet, my head pounding, and looked around the room. The crew was battered but alive, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with terror. Murph was unconscious, his body limp and unresponsive. The monitor flickered back to life, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The creatures were gone, their signals vanished. But the spire, it was changing. The glow was brighter now, almost blinding, and the patterns on its surface were shifting, rearranging themselves into something new. Something that looked disturbingly like writing. The captain turned to me, his face grim. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Before I could respond, the sub lurched violently, throwing us to the floor. The lights flickered and died, leaving us in complete darkness. The last thing I heard was the sound of the spire's pulses, faster now, almost frantic, and the faint, guttural roar of something enormous moving in the depths. I didn't think it was possible for the silence to feel heavier than it already had, but in the wake of the last vibration, the submarine seemed to hold its breath. The groaning of metal under stress was gone. replaced by an absolute void that made my own breathing sound too loud, too frantic. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered a prayer, the words barely audible, but sharp as a knife in the oppressive quiet. I kept my eyes fixed on the dim emergency lights, half convinced that if I looked away, the shadows would swallow me whole. The captain's voice cut through the stillness, harsh and urgent. "Status. Now." His words came out clipped, almost mechanical, but I caught the edge of fear beneath the command. Nobody answered right away. The crew was frozen, some staring blankly at their monitors, others casting nervous glances at the portholes. The faint green glow outside had grown stronger, its sickly hue reflecting off every surface in the control room. It was brighter than it should have been, like the ocean itself was burning with light. Jenkins was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "Ballast tanks are primed, but we're still dead in the water. We can surface manually, but we'll be slow. Too slow if something's still out there." The captain's jaw tightened, his gaze darting to the main monitor. The camera feed was still out, leaving us blind to whatever was happening beyond the hull. "Slow is better than staying here. Start the process. Everyone else, stay sharp." I wanted to believe he was in control, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. None of us knew what we were dealing with, and the uncertainty was worse than anything concrete. I moved to Murph's station, crouching beside him as he stirred weakly. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were open, and when they met mine, I saw something in them that chilled me to the core. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. "It's awake," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have seen it." "What's awake?" I asked, my throat dry. "The creatures? The spire?" Murph shook his head weakly, his gaze shifting to the flickering lights. "It's not separate. None of it. The spire, the creatures, the ocean, it's all one thing, one mind, and we're inside it." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the sub shuddered violently. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the hull, not quite a roar, not quite a groan, but something in between. It vibrated in my chest, rattling my teeth and filling my head with static. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The only illumination came from the green glow outside, now so bright it bathed the control room in an eerie, unnatural light. Then came the sound, a scraping, grating noise, like nails on a chalkboard, but deeper, more visceral. It started at the bow and moved slowly, deliberately, along the hull, as if something enormous was dragging its claws across the metal. I felt the vibrations through the floor, a sickening rhythm that made my stomach churn. The crew was deathly silent, their faces pale as they stared at the walls, as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. The captain barked an order to the engine room, his voice breaking slightly under the strain. "Get those tanks blown. I don't care what it takes. We surface now." The scraping stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the hum of auxiliary power and the distant creak of the sub adjusting to pressure. Then, without warning, the entire vessel lurched to one side, throwing us against the consoles. Alarms blared as the hull groaned under the strain, and I heard the unmistakable sound of water rushing into one of the compartments. "Port ballast tanks breached," someone shouted. "We're taking on water." The captain's face was set in a grim mask as he grabbed the intercom. "Seal off the compartment, now." The crew scrambled to obey, their movements frantic as the sub tilted further. I grabbed a handhold, pulling myself upright as the monitor flickered back to life. What I saw made my blood run cold. The camera feed was distorted, static crackling across the screen, but it was enough to make out the shape. A massive serpentine figure coiling around the sub. Its translucent body seemed to shimmer in the green light, its form both solid and insubstantial, like a mirage made flesh, and its eyes, those terrible, glowing orbs, were fixed directly on the camera. the creature moved suddenly, striking the hull with a force that sent another shudder through the vessel. The impact knocked out the lights again, plunging us into darkness. I could hear the crew shouting, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic, but it was the captain's voice that cut through, sharp and commanding. "Hold your positions. Stay calm. We are not dying down here." It was a valiant effort, but I could see the cracks forming. The crew was terrified, their discipline fraying under the strain, and I couldn't blame them. The sub was dying, the walls groaning under the pressure as water continued to flood the lower compartments. And outside, the creature was still circling, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Then the lights flickered back on, dim and unstable, but enough to illuminate the room. Murph was still slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were fixed on the monitor. "Look," he whispered. The camera feed had shifted, now showing the spire in all its terrible glory. The patterns on its surface were changing again, the glowing lines rearranging themselves into something new. It was writing, but not like anything I'd ever seen. The symbols were fluid, shifting, almost alive, and they pulsed in time with the spire's glow. "It's a warning," Murph said, his voice shaking. "It's telling us to leave." "Then why isn't it letting us?" Jenkins snapped, his voice breaking. "It's playing with us, like a cat with a mouse." I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The creature struck the hull again, harder this time, and I felt the floor buckle beneath me. The captain grabbed the intercom again, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation. "Engine room, I don't care if you have to light a fire under those tanks. Get us to the surface, now!" Before the response could come, the scraping returned, louder and more deliberate. It moved toward the bow, where the green light outside was intensifying. I followed it to the porthole and froze. The spire was glowing brighter than ever, its light pulsing faster, more erratically. And beneath it, rising from the seabed, was something even larger. A shadow, darker than the depths around it, taking shape in the green light. It wasn't just the spire or the creatures, it was something far greater, something ancient, something alive. The captain saw it too, his face pale as he whispered, "Blow the tanks." The roar of escaping air filled the room, and the sub began to rise, slowly at first, then faster as the ballast tanks emptied. The creature lashed out again, its translucent body coiling tighter, but the upward momentum was too much for it to hold. It released us with a final deafening roar, its glowing eyes fixed on the porthole as if promising this wasn't over. We broke through the ice with a thunderous crack, the cold Arctic air rushing in as the hatch was opened. I stumbled onto the deck, gasping for breath, but the relief was short-lived. The spire's light was visible even from the surface, a faint green glow beneath the ice, pulsing slower now, almost at rest, but the symbols, they were burned into the hull, glowing faintly, a message none of us could understand, but all of us felt. It wasn't over. We had escaped, but the Arctic hadn't let us go. Not entirely. It's strange how the mind clings to hope even when every part of you knows the truth. For weeks after we escaped the Arctic, I told myself it was over. The spire was a freak geological formation. The creatures were some undiscovered species, drawn to our sub by vibrations or noise. Even the symbols burned into the hull could be dismissed, a trick of pressure, stress fractures shaped by chance. But deep down, I knew better. We all did. The crew dispersed after debriefing, most of them transferring to other posts, some taking early retirement. Nobody spoke about what happened, not to the Navy, not to each other, not even to themselves, I think. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened at all. The official report classified the mission as a success. The damage to the USS Greystone was attributed to ice debris, the symbols on the hull dismissed as stress patterns. Any mention of the spire or the creatures was scrubbed. The Arctic's silence swallowed the truth, just as it had swallowed so many before us. I might have let it end there, might have convinced myself the cover-up was justified, if not for the dreams. They started a few weeks after the mission, vivid and relentless. I'd wake up gasping for air, my chest tight, the sound of that hum reverberating in my skull. Always I saw the spire, its impossible patterns shifting, glowing, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand, but couldn't escape. At first I thought it was trauma, my mind struggling to process the horror of what we'd seen. But then I started noticing things I couldn't explain. Patterns, coincidences, news stories about unexplained sonar anomalies in the Arctic, ships reporting strange vibrations and equipment malfunctions. A research team from Russia disappeared without a trace. Their icebreaker found adrift with no sign of the crew. Each time the details were buried, hidden beneath mundane explanations. Mechanical failures, human error. But I knew better. I recognized the silence, the cold, the hum that had wormed its way into my dreams. The Navy brought me in for a follow-up debrief 6 months after the mission. They were polite but firm, their questions probing. Had I spoken to anyone outside the service? Did I have any unauthorized materials? They didn't need to say it outright. I was being watched. I gave them what they wanted, assurances of my loyalty, promises to keep my mouth shut, but something about their questions stuck with me, a quiet urgency beneath their calm exterior. They were afraid, not of me, of what I might know, or worse, what I might suspect. The final piece fell into place last year. I'd been working civilian contracts, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and the Navy. A friend from my days on the Greystone, one of the few who hadn't vanished into retirement or obscurity, called me out of the blue. He was drunk, his words slurring as he rambled about the mission, the spire, the creatures. At first, I thought he was having a breakdown, the pressure finally catching up to him, but then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just down there, it's under everything. The whole damn ocean. The ice, the currents, the seabed, it's all part of it, like veins, like a body. I tried to press him for details, but he hung up before I could get any answers. I never heard from him again. I don't think I ever will. But his words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The spire wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was part of something larger, something vast and incomprehensible. The creatures weren't visitors or intruders. They were its servants, or maybe its cells. The dreams grew worse after that, more vivid and more intrusive. They weren't just nightmares anymore, they were something else, waking visions. I'd find myself staring at the patterns on my coffee table, watching them shift and pulse like the spire's glow. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night with the hum in my ears, feeling like the walls were closing in, the air growing colder. And always the same question lingered in my mind. What did we wake up? It's taken me years to piece it together, and even now, I can't be sure I have the full picture, but I know this much. The Arctic isn't just a frozen wasteland, it's a boundary, a barrier keeping something ancient and alive contained. The spire was a warning, a signpost marking the edge of something humanity was never meant to cross, and we crossed it. I've tried to let it go, to move on, but it won't let me. I've spent sleepless nights poring over maps, sonar data, declassified Navy records. The patterns are there if you know where to look. Disturbances in the magnetic field, unexplained seismic activity, missing vessels. It's all connected. Threads of a web stretching across the globe, buried beneath the waves. And the spire was just one node, one piece of a network that might span the entire ocean floor. A living, breathing network. I don't know what it wants, or if it even wants anything at all. Maybe it's not alive in the way we understand life. Maybe it's something older, something alien, something that sees us as no more significant than the plankton drifting through its currents. But whatever it is, it's awake now, and I don't think it's going back to sleep. Sometimes, I wonder if anyone else has seen what we saw, if other missions have stumbled across the same phenomenon. The Navy's silence suggests they know more than they're letting on. Maybe they've known for decades, centuries even, and they've been keeping it hidden to avoid panic. Or maybe they're just as terrified as we are, scrambling to understand something that defies comprehension. Either way, it doesn't matter. The spire is still out there, pulsing beneath the ice, its light growing brighter with every passing year. And the creatures, they're still circling, waiting for something. For us. For the next spark. For the moment when the barrier finally breaks. If you're reading this, you probably think I'm crazy. I wouldn't blame you. I've spent years questioning my own sanity, wondering if the hum in my ears is real or just the echo of a broken mind. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I know it's only a matter of time before the Arctic silence cracks open again, spilling its secrets into the world. They say the ocean is the last unexplored frontier, a vast, unknowable void, but it's not empty. It's watching, waiting. And when it decides to act, we'll learn the truth the hard way. The question isn't if we're ready, it's if we were ever meant to know. Hello, agents. Curious about the most famous and shocking UFO cases? My new ebook uncovers 51 encounters the government tried to hide. Find it in the pinned comment. And if you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe, and there's another one waiting for you right here.